Greetings everyone! Welcome back. We are talking about texture. I'm sure that you've all got an understanding of texture in general, some kind of knowledge about it. So as you gaze at a portion of a work of mine from graduate school, I threw it up there in front of you so that you could see an idea of actual texture. So we're talking about surface character. What does it feel like? What does it look like it feels like? When we feel or describe a surface, it's basically two categories, and it depends on how the light is striking that surface. We can talk about it as being rough or broken. So that's what we have a lot of right here, is that the way that the paint has been applied and the medium that's been mixed with it has given it a volume, and that takes on a three-dimensional aspect. So I can feel that and I can touch it. It is rough and the light is broken as it comes across the surface due to its texture. The other side of things would be smooth or glossy. So when we have a surface like this, the dome of this very practical pencil sharpener that's also a squirrel and a bell jar. How nice is that? I love it. But this surface here would be that smooth or glossy surface, and there isn't a breakup of the material that causes the light to change, and that's why we see it as being smooth. So those are our two basic surfaces that we would be looking at to describe. And in our PowerPoint presentation, we talked about 4 basic types of texture. And the first one is actual, or the real thing. So as we look at this painted surface, this is the real deal. I can run my fingers across it, I can feel it, it's there. Other examples of real texture here. Yep, that rock is for real got texture. I can feel that, right? This piece of wood, texture. So we can look at something that's soft, this fabric, this has texture to it, right? We can feel that, it's actual. The second kind of texture that we looked at would be simulated. So a reproduction, a copy, or a simulation. And I like to think of printed material. So this looks like it's wood, but it's just my paper. It's just a piece of paper with wood printed on it. And since I love natural things, wood things, I have a lot of that kind of paper. And here's another one. So these are simulations, right? It's not real, but it looks or takes on the characteristics here. This little part of the frame, that is a simulation of that texture. We also have our last two, abstract, where we can find hints of the original texture, but oftentimes they're simplified or they emphasize a pattern. And then the last one is invented, and that would be something that has no reference. An invented texture would be purely from the imagination. So with our abstract, we had the example of that Roy Lichtenstein painting where he included textures, but they were a lot more simplified and really transformed into a pattern, or like a cookie cutter, where it's just copy paste. And then the invented texture that we were looking at had the example of Salvador Dali's, probably one of his most well-known paintings, that with all those little melty clocks. So that persistence of memory piece goes into showing us these textures that don't really exist anywhere in particular, but are just rather invented in that piece. Old friends of texture that come alongside and show up when we work with texture would be pattern, composition, and space. So when we talk about pattern, it can be found in the texture, or we can use that texture to create a pattern. With composition, texture becomes a compositional element, and we can use that to create movement in the piece, unity. We can find balance depending on how we're using it, relative dominance in the piece. And then with space, that is how we understand atmospheric perspectives. That idea of using texture to talk about space, we can define, we can separate, and with atmospheric perspective, that's exactly what you're doing with your textures. When things are closer to you, they're crisper, you can read the detail much better. And as things get further away from you and there's more mass between you and that subject, then we lose the detail. It becomes softer. And we've already talked about linear perspective, and that has to do with edges. And when we're out in nature or any kind of a rural setting, there aren't as many edges, right? There's not as many edges. There's not a lot of roads. There's not a lot of rigid structure, man-made structure in which to use those vanishing points. However, we do have that tool of atmospheric perspective wherein we employ texture changes to distinguish our foreground, our middle ground, and our background, with detail decreasing as things recede away from us. So those are how we would like to think about using texture. So what we're going to do for our practice, for our study of texture by way of a homework assignment, is going to be a technique that we looked at in the presentation called Frotage, and that is simply a rubbing. So we'll use our newsprint. Since this paper is a lot more flexible and thinner, it will allow us to press easier against that surface and allow the texture to come through. So you can see that I have 4 different surfaces that I have laid my paper on top of and then rub my pencil across the surface with that texture underneath, and those pieces that are raised are the ones that are receiving that material. So I'm using my 6B graphite pencil, and I have 2 more textures that I would like to place down on my paper. So one of them here, this ought to be interesting because it's dimensional. The other things I've been using have been flat. So we'll give it a try. We'll look for maybe a flatter spot. So I'll put my object down, and then I'm going to put my paper over the top. There is my 5th one. I have to say that working on a rounded surface has proven to be more difficult than the flat surfaces. I don't get to push as hard against that. And maybe not just because it's rounded, but it was also very flexible. Done. A lot nicer here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Done. So for the second part of our homework assignment, we're going to deal with simulated texture. And how we're going to begin is, I'd like for you to get a piece of paper, scrap paper, any kind is fine. I just folded mine in half, and what we're going to do is we're going to make a viewfinder. And I would like for that, I'd like for us to cut out a 3" by 3" window. So I have measured 3 inches here to here, and I've measured 1.5 inches. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make my cuts, and then when I unfold it, I should have my square. See how we did. Oh, looks good. Okay, so this is what we call a viewfinder, and it helps to select your composition is what this is for. And we are going to use it that way. This viewfinder is what we are going to place over the textures that we are going to recreate. For instance, if I have this as one of my textures that I want to simulate, then I will place my viewfinder over the top of it, and this way I can select, or I can turn it, I can select what part of this I'm going to be seeing in my drawing. So it helps to narrow down that visual information and allow us to focus in on a specific place. So that's what the viewfinder is for. And then what you would want to know is that we're going to have 6 boxes here on our heavyweight paper, and they are going to be the same size, right, as our viewfinder, so that everything we're seeing here in this window is what's going to be described in this window here on our page. So we're going to create a viewfinder. Voila, that handy folding trick there to get a square, a 3" by 3" square. And then on our heavyweight paper, go ahead and use your HB graphite pencil, and we're going to make 6 3" by 3" squares. Okay, now that we have this set up, the material that I would like for you to work with today, your graphite pencils, as well as your technical pens. And those will be our tools. So the last things that we will require will be reference imagery. So that can be in the form of a secondary source. So that would be something that's considered a print. And this is also our simulated texture. And the other thing that you could utilize would be something that has an actual texture, but you want to be able to lay your viewfinder across that So once I have my boxes laid out, then I'm going to choose my very first texture to work with, and I'm going to use my technical pens for 3 boxes. I'm going to use my graphite for 3 boxes. So we'll have some practice with those couple of mediums in working through simulated texture. So I'm going to work right in here. And so when I look inside of this frame, my frame is the same size as this, so I just need to plug in this information over here. I'm going to use my graphite pencil to begin my layout. I feel like that would, with a permanent material, that would be the best route for me. And I can look at the edges of this frame and see that I have pretty equal divisions on these 4, so that needs to be a little bit smaller right in there. And I have a pretty even division here. And this is just going to act as my guide. And drawing really lightly, no need to indent the paper. That's what happens when you draw in the dining room because there's no heat in the studio and it's cold. You get helpers. That is the advantage of working upright rather than horizontal, so you don't get cats laying on your artwork. So now I've got a rough layout of what it is that I am going to be filling in with my texture. So now would be a wonderful time to go ahead and try out some of those textures. And again, the reason that we have that scrap piece of paper is we can experiment without the repercussion of that finished piece being a flub. Okay. My recommendation with the pen is that you put in as many guidelines as you feel is necessary to place your permanent marks down, because all that graphite can be erased, especially if we're keeping it light. So I'm going to move on to a new texture, and with this one I am going to choose to work with my graphite pencils. So this is a cheese grater. I've just placed my viewfinder over the top of it for a section, and we're talking about texture, which this certainly has. And the surface material happens to be reflective. So when we look at this, right, it's reflecting all of the information around because of its metallic surface, right? It's a shiny surface. When we're talking about surface descriptions, reflective surfaces follow the exact same observations that we have been making with other objects and with our other studies, is that we're looking for specifics, right? These details. We're looking for proportion, accurate placement that will give us that proportion, being as specific as possible with detail, and then looking at our value, the amount of contrast there is, the shape of those values. And with something like this, it's highly repetitive. It does not mean that it's a cookie cutter where each highlight is the same as you go along. They will be quite similar because their shape and how they relate to the light source is so closely packed together. But I would encourage you to continue to look individually at each piece, just like when we were beginning to work with contour line, and we wanted to understand that each piece, oh, here's Thumbs again. Say hi, buddy. That each piece is individual. The parts of a whole are exactly that. They are parts. So even if it is a leaf that has 5 offshoots, each of those parts of the leaf are going to have an individual characteristic. So we want to continue to look for those individual characteristics within each of these areas. And there really is not a trick to working with a reflective surface or a transparent surface. The thing that we have to be diligent about in order to have the drawing look metallic or look like glass or look like acrylic is for us to, as closely as we can, replicate where these lights and shadows are, the shapes of those lights and darks, as well as paying attention to the transitions from those lights to midtones to darks. That will make all the difference. So in this example, I can see there's a really hard edge right at the bottom of this highlight, and again at the top, but over here towards the back side, it starts to soften and heather as it moves into a different value. So as we continue to look along the surface, there's a hard cut here, and then we get into this rise, and we start to see soft changes in value. So the edge that you have, the contrast that you have, the placement, the shape, that is what is going to give the appearance of that reflective surface or that transparent surface. It's not from doing any kind of hoodoo voodoo magic. It's just paying attention to where things are and plugging them into those spaces. I don't wish it were more exciting, but that's what I wanted to say, that and Thumbs is back, that I wish it were more exciting or more magical, but it's not. So as I get ready to place my information, I'm going to think about the way in which I worked with my vine charcoal and we did a toned surface drawing, and I think that that is what I would like to do for this piece. Is I think that I would like to have some medium down on my page, and I would like to be able to lift out as well as plug in. So lift out my lights and place in my darks. Something that's really nice about working with textures, or something that can be nice about working with them, is that sometimes there's a very clear pattern. In this instance there is, and since it's man-made, then once we figure out where one thing is, we can figure out where the next bits of information are. And once I figure out the distance between one column of these holes, then I can find the location of the next ones, and then that lets me know for all the other information that's here that it's going to be the very same distance. So once I set that up, I can go ahead and replicate that in my drawing. So the setup becomes a little bit more simple. It would remind us of our work with perspective, and knowing that once we, a lot of what we do in one place is the same as what we do in another. So that consistency is really helpful for us in laying out the information in a texture piece that may happen to have a pattern to it. Alright gang, it's finally done. The texture project is complete, and what we want to think about when we're looking at our textures, again, we're looking at surface character, and we have two basic types of surface character. One is that rough broken surface, and the other is our smooth and glossy surface. And you can see examples of both of those basic types of surfaces presented in the 6 cubes, and the different types of texture that we're going to be working with for our homework project are actual and simulated texture. Remember, we looked at actual, simulated, abstract, and invented in the PowerPoint presentation, and here we have all of these are simulated, right? That's what we do in our class. It's drawing from observation, and we want to simulate what is in front of us, and specifically when we're looking at texture, we're looking to simulate that surface character. So when we look at our homework, how we started was with our Frotage. So we wanted to be sure to look at actual textures. So going around your home, work, neighborhood, inside, outside, and finding surfaces that have some touchable, something that you can feel and would translate into a texture. We're using our graphite pencils. I believe I used my 2B, it could have been a 4B, but either of those graphite pencils would work really well to do your rubbings. Remember that we're doing 6 of those rubbings on a sheet of the newsprint. And we're using the newsprint because it's a softer page, so you'll be able to have a better result with that texture coming through. If we work with that heavyweight paper, you have to work a lot harder to get the nuance of that surface character coming up through the page. And this is a really great technique. So it's not only to explore what actual texture looks like, but it's another technique that you can put in your drawing toolkit to pull in to create backgrounds, or like we talked about with abstract texture, you can bring that in perhaps a place that it doesn't quite belong as you continue to make work, or simply as a background. And then after this, right, this is the part 1. Part 2 is we're moving on to that heavyweight paper, and we're moving on to the heavyweight paper because it accepts our medium with a lot more manipulation. So we can go in, especially with the graphite pencil, and we can add, subtract, make changes again and again without compromising the integrity of the paper. So it's going to hold that material better, allow you to make a lot more adjustments as you go through. And it also works really well with your technical pens. It holds the ink. It doesn't excuse me, do a lot of spreading because that tooth is just meant to absorb that information. So for this part of the homework, remember that we're going to have you find 6 different textures to simulate. And ideally, I would like for you to work from an actual object as well as secondary sources. And those secondary sources, for me, I have this beautiful, whoa, I don't know if you can see it, but I have this wonderful book, and I pulled some imagery and placed my viewfinder over some of these pieces in here. So when I talk about secondary sources, that is texture that's already been simulated for you because it's a photograph or some kind of a reproduction. And then the actual texture would be things that you can grab. So, you know, if you were working from some kind of actual fruit or veg, or I used my wood table as one of my surfaces. I also used a pumpkin that I still have from autumn, and I used my cheese grater. So the cheese grater made an appearance in the Frotage as well, so I guess it's a popular item around these parts. It just has a really excellent texture. So you're going to be choosing 6 different textures to simulate / render, and for 3 of them you're going to work in graphite, and for 3 you're going to work in your ink, please. The other thing that you need to do that we talked about at the beginning of this is you're going to need to make yourself a viewfinder, and this opening is going to be the same size as your squares down on your paper. And that's to let you know everything that you see through this viewfinder is going to end up in that 3" by 3" square. So if you want to make it easy on yourself, fold your paper in half, go 1.5 inches by 3, and then when you cut it and unfold it, you'll have your 3 by 3. The other thing that I was suggesting is that you have a scrap piece of newsprint, and this could be one that you've been doing your thumbnail drawings on, and this would be a great place for you to try out different techniques if you're thinking about what kind of texture and how you want to work with that with your various mediums. This is a wonderful place to try it. This, not so much, because you do have room to work with the graphite, but the pen is very permanent. That's an indelible mark. So you want to do all your tryouts, test runs on a scrap piece of paper. The other thing that we know from our previous work is that it's helpful to have a scrap piece of paper if you want to change the surface of the tip on your graphite pencil, if you want something softer, or if you want to preload your kneaded eraser with some graphite. You're going to need a pool of material to draw from. So you can do all that messy work over here so that the messy work doesn't end up over here. So I think that's all that we need to cover. This is a wonderful investigation. It gets us looking at, you can look at metallic surfaces or reflective surfaces. You could look at transparent surfaces, and then obviously the rough broken surfaces. It's all, I think you would understand by now that the treatment doesn't vary depending on what it is that we're looking at. When we're drawing from observation, we're looking for those key elements of art, so we want to understand what the value of it is, what the shape of it is. Texture is one of those key elements, but it is composed of all of the other bits that we already have: line, form, value, and space. So all those things that we understand already. So go forth, draw, make an excellent piece, and as always, please use the discussion forum on our Canvas page. Email me with questions, and then I will look forward to seeing some really radical drawings from you, and by that I mean excellent. Okay, happy drawing.